Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us at this hour. I understand you're not allowed to bring food or drink in here, so no one, sneak anything in here or Ray Kelly will bust you. So Ray Kelly, longest serving commissioner in New York history from 92 to 94, and then from 02 to 2013. He has a new book coming out in September, Vigilance, about his career, which includes things like being a Marine in Vietnam. He is now the president of Risk Management Services at Cushman & Wakefield, and we're going to talk about policing and maybe also about a little bit about terrorism at the end, because the number of threats we've been hearing about has been going up. But let's start with policing. There have been a lot of stories, obviously, over the last many months about these flashpoint moments in different cities across the country. Let's start very broadly, and then we'll get more specific. What's the state of policing right now in the United States? How would you describe it?
Well, that's a good question. I've been in the business, if you will, for a long time, and in my view, in the overall perspective, policing has never been more professional. Police officers have never been better trained, better educated, more diverse, more restrained. However, there are still many, many issues, and I think the horrific events that happened certainly in North Charleston, South Carolina, in Cleveland, those sorts of things that we see so vividly portrayed on television, has caused a lot of introspection to take place. A lot of very, I think, thoughtful young chiefs in the country are looking at what they're doing, what should they be doing. Crime has gone down significantly in the last 2 decades, and I believe that's a result of smarter policing, better use of technology, tactics that have worked, and I think the beneficiary of that, we're all beneficiaries of it, but to a large extent, it's communities of colors in our major cities. But that's where most of the tension lies, quite frankly. So it's a difficult time for police executives.
Is it the key problem across all police, or is it just in in many acute cases? In other words, if I'm a chief somewhere, is this something I've got to keep at the top of my mind right now?
Yes, I think so, irrespective of even the demographics of your jurisdiction, because the world has gotten to be such a smaller, closely knit place now. So you have to keep your eye on the ball in little towns and big towns and major cities, because some of the issues just transcend the geography.
Let's step back a minute before we get to our current period in history. You talked about the improvement in the force across the country. What was behind that? Is it the use of metrics? Is it just better training? Where was the story about policing going before we got to our current moment?
I think it's both of those things and more. I think training has improved. You see a lot of regional training now, which you didn't see, say, 20, 25 years ago, county-wide training, that sort of thing. So some of the professionalism, if you will, have certainly gone down to the smaller jurisdictions. Technology has made a difference. A lot more information in the hands of police officers on the street, let alone the police department, but being able to disseminate it out to officers in the street. I think the quality of police officers has generally improved. My own view, as I've been talking about this for years, I think police officers, generally speaking, should be required to have a 4-year college degree, a baccalaureate degree. Virtually every teacher in America has a 4-year college degree, but it's not the requirement in police departments, all but just a handful. And the job has become much more complex, much more demanding, and police officers have an awful lot of power, awesome power when you think about it, the power of life and death. So I think that would make a big difference. Now, we see it, we see education levels rising, but I think, in my view, it should be a requirement.
When you look at the flashpoint moments you mentioned in North Charleston, in New York, in Baltimore, in Ferguson, and there are also 24 or so Justice Department investigations into different police forces, there's obviously a systemic problem, maybe not across all police forces, but there's something happening in that many places. Where should we look for where the problem comes from?
Well, the problems are coming from, quite frankly, cities that have a significant minority community or minority communities. That's where you see the flashpoints, and quite frankly, that's where you see a disproportionate amount of crime. So that crime attracts the police, and the interaction is where the friction is. And of course, this is not something new. But now we have everybody over 10 years of age with a camera. Now we have a lot more, the 24-hour news cycle, just a lot more focus on it. But that's, for the most part, where the issues lie today.
And is that a problem that comes from lack of training of individual members of the police? Is it something that police chiefs have not been paying enough attention to, this conflict in the community?
No, I think there's a lot of attention being paid to and has been paid to it, but it's just human beings going to make mistakes. Police officers are human beings. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for what happened in North Charleston, South Carolina. That was an out-and-out murder. That was horrific. And of course, to a lot of people who have been suspicious of the police for a long time, it is suspicious confirmed, because it appears that this police officer, not only did he shoot Walter Scott in the back, it appears that he dropped evidence, that he was trying to plant evidence. So people say, aha, this is what we believed, all along. So you see that so graphically portrayed. It's going to, keep the flames going.
Well, that's right. I mean, people I've talked to in the African American community had two strong reactions came through from that. But the one that keys to what you're saying is they said, it looked like the officer in that case, he had a script in his head. He knew what to do when he did something wrong, which is he automatically took the taser and planted it on the body, which is, the argument is this is behavior that wasn't just in this one particular police officer, that there is a script for when you do this, and you kind of know, you plant the taser and you say you were doing it in self-defense.
Well, in some people's minds, there may be that script. I think this is clearly an aberration. This is just this type of activity, of course, is so infinitesimal in the amount of occurrences like this. But yeah, I can understand how people see this as now we finally have proof that this type of activity goes on.
And that incident, after that incident, you said that you thought body cameras were a good idea. Was that something that changed your mind, or what's your thinking about that?
Well, what I said initially was I think we need to test cameras because they will make police officers hesitate, no question in my mind. That can be a good thing in some people's minds, it could be a bad thing, but I thought we needed more time to look at it. But having seen that event, and we'll see that film for decades to come. I won't be around, but it'll be around. I think any police officer wearing a camera would never have engaged in that type of activity. So the train has left the station as far as cameras are concerned. I think police department should embrace it, should not resist it. There are issues as to how you store it, who gets access to it, those sorts of things all have to be worked out. But I believe that you'll see a lot more heroic effort, a lot more great work on the part of police who are wearing cameras than misconduct.
And talk us through that delay. If you're wearing a camera, and there's also, this is another suggestion in the Cleveland Police Department, which is that every time an officer unholsters his weapon, that there's a recording of that. Is that also, are those measures, just sort of explain from your perspective how that affects an officer in the field, if they're wearing a camera, give us for instance of how that.
Well, of course, this is uncharted water. We don't know, we're gonna have to see. But I think, again, the human reaction may be, hey, whatever I'm going to get engaged in here is gonna be filmed. So maybe there's a big fight going on. Maybe I'll sit in the patrol car for an extra 20 seconds until it sorts out. As far as the recording when you take out a weapon. You know, in a big city, in a patrol car, you could go to maybe 4 burglary calls, a tour, or maybe a robbery, that sort of thing. Police officers have their guns out more than the public realizes. Recording that, I think, is somewhat unrealistic. I don't think it'll be adhered to necessarily, but they're not pointing it at people, but they do. If they approach a scene, may have their weapon in their hand. I know Cleveland has put that requirement in. I don't know if that's realistic or not.
Unrealistic from a paperwork standpoint, or from it doesn't tell
Reporting
you?
it from, I don't know. I assume it's meant to discourage police officers from doing that, but they want to go home at night, so they're going to take their weapon out in dangerous situations and hold it by their side, but it's going to happen. So I think it won't be reported as much as it happens.
Right. You mentioned they want to go home at night. What does a member of the community, whether it's a young African-American man or anybody who's got police in their community, what do they need to know about the perspective of the police officer? I mean, because a lot of people talk about improving community police relations as kind of each side needs to know where the other's head is. So what do they need to know about what a police officer's got in his head when he walks into a situation?
Well, obviously, they're concerned about their own safety. The adrenaline flows. People think that police are robots. No, they aren't. They're human beings. They're concerned about their own safety. They may have a history of a particular location, what's happened there, what's happened over time, that might govern some of their conduct, some of their actions. I understand the whole stop question and first issue is a big one. It's not pleasant to be stopped and searched. Everybody understands that, but it's a tool, and in certain areas, it's a very important tool. It should be in the toolbox. So if someone is in that situation, the best advice would be to go along with it and just cooperate.
I want to get to stop and frisk in a moment, but let's turn the question on its head. What should a police officer know about a young African-American male when he goes into a situation in which he's been called there for some reason?
Well, again, you like to know the history of a particular location. Now, with the improvements in technology, a lot of information is going to police officers before they arrive on the scene, and we want to increase that more and more, so they'll have some sense of what they're going into, a history of a location. Now, as far as an individual is concerned, it may be suspicious activity, may know nothing about this individual. So, in terms of what a young person should know about the police officer, as I say, you just cooperate and don't resist.
Because what I'm getting at here is something I talked to Congressman Elijah Cummings. It's his district in Baltimore that had the riots a couple of months back after the Freddie Gray incident. And he said constantly young African-American males were coming up to him and saying, what do I do? A sense of vulnerability that had increased. They already lived with a sense of vulnerability. The idea that when you saw the police, it was very possible you were going to come out on the losing end of some kind of altercation. I mean, that they were already in his district nervous about the police. Now it had gotten to the point where they were at a total loss about how to handle and approach the police. I mean, how do you deal with such a situation?
I don't know if that's actually the feeling that a lot of people have. Sure, they're concerned about the police, but as I said before, all you have to do is just follow the instructions, and you'll avoid problems. I mean, Baltimore has big issues now. It's 60 murders since the beginning of May. So, and also there were stories out that the police are not engaging with people. So right now in Baltimore, there's a significant problem. But in New York City, which is my frame of reference, 97% of the shooting victims are Black or Latino. 90% of the murder victims are Black or Latino. So in that community is going to have a disproportionate amount of police there, because any police executive will tell you that's where we're going to put our resources, where the workload is. So yeah, you're probably going to have more encounters with the police with African American males, certainly in Baltimore.
There's been some talk in the wake of, and again, I want to get back to proactive policing, stop and frisk, and the case you make about those kinds of tools in the toolkit actually help minority communities. But there's also been an alternative response, which is teaching de-escalation in training, which is, again, in a lot of those communities, they would say, well, cooperating with the police is great if the police is kind of on the level, but they have such a sense of distrust. They think, I can try and cooperate, but I know this story and this story and this story of where a police overstepped his bounds or got me for doing something I didn't mean to do or stopped me, excessive number of times when I wasn't doing anything. So they don't think that they're going to end up on the winning end of a transaction where they just say, okay, I'll do whatever you say.
Yeah. In terms of de-escalation, that's been, when I was in the police academy, we're teaching de-escalation. So it's something that is very much addressed in police training, certainly in police academy training for new recruits. Verbal, judo, these things have been around for years. So the notion that somehow de-escalation is not taught is simply not the case. But it's driven by the circumstances that the police officer encounters. I mean, de-escalation sounds nice in an academic setting, but you get out of your patrol car and there's 40 people fighting, or the tumultuous situation. There's certain actions that you have to take, and certain actions the public expects the police to take. But de-escalation is by no means a new concept. It's something that's fundamental to policing.
But I guess they should be taught more. Should the number of hours? I mean, is there a?
Well, I mean, that's an issue. The question is how much do you train firearms versus physical training versus de-escalation. I mean, I think that's something that should be looked at, but it's not a new concept.
If you were dropped in the middle of the country somewhere and asked to run a police force, and you were sensitive to these issues, what would your checklist be in terms of making sure that the force was up to standards, all the different standards, but obviously this question of relationship with the community being?
Well, there's a lot of things I'd like to look at, and I'd like to look at the testing that's given to police candidates before they become police officers. I think more has to be done in areas for psychological testing. I think bullying is an area that I would have liked to know more about. If you've been bullied, or if you are a bully, you have some record of that. What impact does that have when you give that person a gun and a lot of power? Diversity. You want a police force that, as much as possible, mirrors the community that it serves. Why? Because it's easier, quite frankly. Practically speaking, it makes the job easier. It certainly makes the job of a police executive easier. I wouldn't want to use the military approach, and it's one of the issues that's out there today. I think the optics are very bad. It was put in place in the 90s when there was just an excess of military equipment, but it's really not appropriate for the streets of America unless there's extreme situations. Probably, a natural disaster, that sort of thing. But I think that sort of equipment should be kept on in some sort of central location, perhaps by the state or the county. I'd like to know, those sorts of things. I would say one of the demographics of the community. I'd like to know the education level of the police officers. You look at a history as to what's gone on in the past, what sort of complaints there were. I'd like to also look at the type of training. I believe in scenario-based training. The more you can do that, I think the better off you are. In other words, role-playing training. In New York City, under Mayor Bloomberg, we built a new police academy, $1 billion police academy, that now allows for a lot more hands-on scenario training, which which is a good thing. So those are some of the issues that I would look at.
And that scenario training, presumably, if there's a higher sensitivity or tweaks that need to be made with the way the police interacts with the community, presumably you can take the force and have them go through a new level of training.
Yeah.
I mean, it allows not only for new police officers, but to also put new practices in the force that exists at the moment, right?
Let me tell you what we used to do with the recruits in the academy. Let's say there's 1,800 recruits. Obviously, things are bigger. In New York City, the population's 8.4 million people. So just before they graduate from the police academy, we would give them a 4-day immersion course, we called it. And we did it in the Apollo Theater. And it's quite a sight to see 1,800 police officers in front of the Apollo Theater and then inside the theater. But we would have a variety of scenarios during the 4 days of training. One of them would be a transgender person walking into a police station. You know, those sorts of experiences that police, you know, surprised about. They don't think about it. Walking into a police station can be a very intimidating experience. So those sorts of things that you need space to do it, you need the opportunity to do it, and that's hopefully what's going forward with the new police academy in New York City.
Let's talk about stop and frisk. First of all, tell us what stop and frisk is.
It's a good question. Stop and frisk is something that goes back to common law. And by the way, the term is really pejorative. It should be a field interrogation or something along those lines. But the advocates love that term because it really, you know, connotes touching people all the time, that sort of thing. So it's a common law right of the constable to engage someone who is involved in some sort of suspicious behavior. This process was validated by the Supreme Court, Terry versus Ohio, in 1968. And it's on the books in virtually every jurisdiction in America. And it says, in essence, that a police officer in a public place, he sees someone who they believe is about to commit, is committing or has committed a crime, they can stop and question that person, ask them what they're doing. If they can articulate ultimately a danger or a sense of danger to themselves, they can do a limited pat down. Now, in New York City, we had a lawsuit that started in 1999. It started by the Center for Constitutional Rights. It went with stipulation, the police department, we agreed to it, the city agreed to it. When that consent ended, we started a new lawsuit, the same entity, Center for Constitutional Rights, separate plaintiffs, and it went to trial in 2013. And the trial, in my judgment of a lot of other people, was not a fair one. And the allegation was, and since 1999, that police were indiscriminately stopping people and disproportionately stopping people who were African American for the most part. We engaged the RAND Institute. RAND has been around for 100 years. We asked them, how do you determine racial profiling? What should the criteria be? They said, well, number one, it shouldn't be arrest data because your arrest policies could be prejudiced. It shouldn't be census data because that is, carried out to its logical conclusion, half the people you stop would be women. What they propose is that the proper criteria is the description of the perpetrators of violent crime by the victims of violent crime. Government, in theory, has nothing to do with it. I've been robbed. I give you the description of who robbed me. Put it in a database. In New York City, the description of perpetrators of these types of crimes runs and historically run, certainly for the last several years, about 69% African American. The stops of African Americans by the NYPD has consistently been about 53%. So you have this gap between people who are supposedly, or described as having committed these crimes and actually being stopped. Now, the judge would not accept this in trial. Wouldn't accept it as evidence Instead, you had someone propose a formula, a professor, that was based on census data. And the city's position is not flawed because, again, as I said, taken to its ultimate conclusion, it would be, you'd be stopping women. In any event, there was a finding of indirect racial profiling, which the term had never been used before. The city appealed. The judge herself was removed from the case by the appellate division because of pretrial partiality, is what it was called. The city appealed the case, and there was great confidence that it would have been overthrown. However, Mayor de Blasio was elected, and he stopped the appeal from going forward. So the result of this in New York City is the fact that these stops are way down, and we'll have to see what the overall impact is. But shootings and murders are up, and there's concern in the city about that.
And do you see it? Do you think there's a direct correlation between them?
Well, I think it's common sense. If you're someone who has a gun and has a propensity to carry a gun, you're going to be more likely to do it if you know that the chances of being stopped are much less than they used to be.
So if it was brought back at the previous levels, do you think crime would go down in New York?
I think there's a very good chance of that. There's other programs in place that we did. That this is not by any means the be-all and end-all of crime suppression, but it's a valuable tool, and it's down to an unnatural level. Which, by the way, in New York, the stop rate is less than it was at the time of the trial. In Los Angeles, in Baltimore, in Chicago. Chicago was a 4 times greater stop rate than New York City had. So it's still going on in other places, to the best of my knowledge, but in New York, it's certainly been pulled back.
The downside, of course, to stop and frisk from the community standpoint is it leads to essentially the condition of what people sometimes call being arrested for being black. That basically, that the statistics you cite in the kind of light of the classroom suggest one thing, but in the community, this is the kind of thing that leads to this sense of distrust. Is there a way to fix that with this particular?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not as, it polls about 50-50 really in communities of color, believe it or not, because they know it's a valuable tool. The advocates have one position. It doesn't necessarily represent what I'll call grassroots in a lot of these communities. Yeah, we had an ongoing training program for stop, question, and frisk. All police officers had to go through it. We did it on a revolving or ongoing basis, I should say. The judge did not accept this, this type of information. So a lot of effort has been made, and I think in 2013, which was the last year of the Bloomberg administration, the police department had a 70% approval rating. And I had a 75% approval. I don't say that to brag. I say that because the campaign, and campaign run by many people trying to be mayor, and obviously Mayor de Blasio as well, I argue that there was this great split, a great divide between the police and the communities of color. And yet, in that 70% was I think 58% approval rating from the black community.
Before we open it up to a few questions, I want to switch just briefly to terror and the threats that may be facing cities like New York City, but also now potentially cities all over the country. You obviously there were for the period after 9/11. What I hear in Washington from people in the intelligence community and members on the relevant committees is that a lot of new kinds of threats coming through, a real sense of nervousness about the chatter that's out there, about the changing nature of the threat. What's your sense of where things are? Is it just the same old threat, but there's more of it? Is it a new kind of threat?
Well, I think ISIS has been a game changer. They've been around since 1999. Different Al-Qaeda in Iraq was their still title, but quite frankly, they caught the intelligence community by surprise. They went in and took over Mosul, a city of 1.5 million people. We basically knew nothing about it, which is, and on its own, I think, an area that requires some more examination. Yeah, I think the threat has changed as a result of ISIS because they are putting out these, what I'll call inspirational messages that are being adhered to. There's the communications director, if you will, of ISIS is Mohammed al-Dini. And he's been putting out these messages, actually starting in, not starting, but coming out with great frequency last September when we started the bombing campaign. The message is do what you can. The Ummah, the universe of Muslims, our religion is being attacked all over. You have a religious obligation to defend your religion. And obviously some people have taken that to heart. That right after that, you saw the attacks in Ottawa, the Canadian troops. You saw 2 New York City police officers attacked by someone with a hatchet. The Charlie Hebdo situation in Paris probably motivated something like that. So you see a lot of this. Now, they're very skilled as far as social media is concerned, and they're putting out, as we've heard, as many as 90,000 tweets or retweets a day. Very difficult for the intelligence community to get their arms around that. What you also see is this sort of change to basic weaponry. You see what happened in Tunisia. Here is one person with an AK-47 and 4 magazines, killed 38 people and wounded 30-something more. So, you know, we've been looking for the sort of the sophisticated attack, the one like 9/11, that sort of thing, but they sort of morphed into a just a very basic, go out and do what you can. The motivating factor to a large extent is the creation of a caliphate, which is this Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is the nom de guerre of the caliph of this location. This is sort of a galvanizing force for young jihadis all over the world to come and fight for ISIS, or if you can't, do what you can where you are. So, and you've seen the threat metastasize. You've seen it now in you know, certainly not just in Syria and Iraq, but other places as well, even Afghanistan. We just saw today an attack or yesterday, I guess, in Sinai, under the Egyptian army. ISIS is claiming credit for that. So I think it's a cause for concern. It's very difficult to track these people. The way it's been done to a large extent is to go into chat rooms. And in the police department, we were fortunate. We, through an aggressive recruiting program, we have police officers in the department now born in 106 countries. So this tremendous language capability. And obviously not everybody can do that. But the chat rooms have been fertile ground. Now, will they continue to be? Difficult to say. So I am not optimistic as far as ISIS is concerned. We're going to be fighting this fight for a long time.
All right, let's turn it to questions here. If anybody, question we have. Yes.
Commissioner, you talked about the stats of stop and frisk. I just kind of want to get an idea from you. You know, I know that recently Mayor Blasio has talked about recruiting more police officers, and I think Commissioner Bratton has talked about how black recruiting people of color is harder because stop and frisk put a lot of these people into the system, and they can't now become police officers. Can you speak a little bit more towards how the NYPD specifically can better reach out to not only African-American communities in light of the trauma that stop and frisk has inflicted upon them, but also just in pure terms of recruitment? How do you get more of them on the force when this is the image that a lot of us have of the police officer?
Yeah. First of all, the population of New York City, the black population, about 23% of the city's population. The police department is about 16% now, 15, 16%. It was up as high as 70%. That's not a bad ratio. Do we need more African Americans? Yes, but it's not a bad ratio. Stop and frisk is not put on anyone's record. It just is not. The name is a database that precludes you from putting someone's name in it. So the notion that somehow someone's been stopped and that's a matter of record, it's not so. It's just not the case. I think more recruitment has to be done through the black churches. I actually did that. I was commissioner once before, and I actually did it, and with some success. What happened was, ironically, something that I had pushed for, a 60-credit college requirement, 60 college credit requirement, was coming into play, but it didn't have to actually kick in. We wanted the next administration to grandfather people on the list that I was instrumental in putting together with Mayor Denkins. And we were successful in going to black churches and increasing the numbers significantly. So I think there's still potential there. Interestingly enough, the college credit requirement was thought to somehow reduce the number of minorities who want to come into policing. The fact of the matter is that people of color have a higher credit level than white candidates or white police officers. So I think there's still, I think there is a lot of fertile ground in working with black churches. But the number is not, as bad as many other cities.
Yes, the woman in the white there, yes.
Hi. So a popular contrast for policing in America has been policing in the UK, where police do not carry firearms, and deaths and incidents from police and firearms are astronomically lower than they are in the US. And I realize that guns don't kill people, people kill people. But my question for you is, do you foresee, if the trends that have been happening in the media continue with gun incidents, could it ever happen that we revoke or question the police in America's need to carry guns?
That police would give up their guns. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think practically speaking, the answer is no. I think the unions are just simply too strong. Policing is a very heavily unionized universe of people. In the UK, there are very few guns in the country. Here, it's estimated we have 300 million guns. So if we ended gun sales tomorrow, we'd still have 300 million guns out there somehow. It's not a wasting asset. You can take a gun that's 80 years old, pull the trigger, it's going to go off. So we have a real problem here with the number of guns in our country. We have way too many guns in my judgment, but you will not see anything happen in Washington on either side of the aisle. It is seen as the third rail, and don't expect anything soon. The gun show loophole, for instance, is something that I think even NRA members are supported as far as closing it. What do I mean by gun show loophole? You have gun shows in all over America, and in that environment, the notion is that individual sellers and buyers can go to a gun show and sell to each other, buy a gun, that sort of thing, without any record. So that has tremendous potential for abuse. I used to be Undersecretary of Treasury, and the ATF reported to me, and I'm privy to a lot of these records. We had one individual seller who had 800 guns. So this is a business that happens at these gun shows. Some states have rules and laws against it, but it's still a huge gap where a lot of guns come through. At one time, the ATF said 40% of crime guns were coming through the gun shows. There's no movement to close that gap in Washington. So we're gonna be in the status quo for quite a while, and I think it's difficult to ask police officers not to be armed in that sort of the world that we live in.
We have time just for a couple more questions. The gentleman in the blue shirt here, and then the blue shirt there, and those will be our last two.
My name is Bob Jeffrey. I live in New York. Just one quick thing. I have a question, but I moved to New York in 1971, lived in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and so from my point of view, you know, New York is a much safer place than it was in the 70s. But anyway, here's the question. In the spirit of Aspen, when you were talking about ISIS and social media, and I think about what's going on with the police, not only in New York, but other cities around the country, it seems to me that there's a communications gap with the police around the country, and by that I mean everything that happens with the police, they're on their back foot, they're being reactive. Is there an opportunity to turn it around, meaning for the police to take a more proactive stance in the community in terms of what they're doing on the positive side? Because it seems to me that there's this gap that exists out there that either the media fills or whatever when there's a tragedy that happens or a murder that happens, but I just don't get the sense of, you know, the police being as proactive as they could be given the world that we live in with social media and the fact that everybody has a device that can photograph and tweet and post things. So,
Yeah.
just a question.
No, it's a good point, but you know, I've been around a long time, and there's many efforts that have begun and still going on to work closely with the community. Part of the problem is that they get very little press coverage. Let me give you just one example. I started a cricket league and a soccer league, mostly aimed at young men from South Asia. And it was tremendously well received. It was front page news in India, and there was articles in Pakistan. It got no coverage in New York City at all. If it bleeds, it leads is the mantra of the press. So in order to get these types of programs out there, it's very difficult for the citizens to know about it. Yes, they're ongoing. The police department has a huge community affairs operation. We bring community members into police stations. I would go to I'm not just saying me, certainly commanders as well. I would go to churches, mosques, synagogues. At least twice a week, I'd be in some one of those religious entities. There's PAL, there's a police athletic league. There's the Boys Club of New York. I happen to be on the board of that organization. So there's lots of things going on that the average citizen just doesn't know about. Why? Because you get your news from the newspaper or now through online. A lot of efforts. Could there be more? And probably. And is it spotty throughout the country? Yeah, it probably is. But as I said before, the world's gotten a lot smaller. So if something works in city X, city Y, a police department is going to be looking at it pretty soon. So I guess my message is there's a lot of effort being given to working more closely with communities, particularly minority communities, but the information concerning that is just not getting out.
Final question, because we're out of time.
You talked about advocating for psychological testing of police officers. Would you also be in favor of looking at data that would measure sort of implicit or unconscious bias that police officers may have about communities of color? Because that could factor into sort of micro decisions when you're talking about, like, communities of color. If you're stopped by a police officer, just cooperate, and the differences between that implicit bias when a police officer is evaluating maybe their own safety versus being disrespected.
Sure, if that could be put into an instrument, and that's part of the challenge. How do you test for these things with difficulty? Now, in NYPD, and you also have to remember that all of these processes are subjected, certainly in New York City, to lawsuits. Someone who is rejected psychologically sues, and then there'll be a change, or they'll go to the Civil Service Commission, and they'll allow people to be hired. So it's no easy task just to put in new criteria. Would I support that? Yes, if in fact it could be tested. If it's, in fact, an instrument could be created to do that.
All right, we've run out of time. Thank you, Ray Kelly. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, John.